All right, it is 8 o'clock, and it is time for the next panel, which is a short but concise title called Why 3D. My name is Andy. I'm going to be the host of this panel, and I have with me four amazing panelists. So let me do some introductions here. We have Christiane Hütter, who is a pre-doctoral fellow in the Menche Lab at the Technical University in Vienna. Chris joined the group in 2020 as a guest scientist. She studied architecture and bioengineering in Vienna and Glasgow. Her main focus in the lab is to redefine network visualization methodologies and to develop novel approaches for complex data representation, operating at the interface of art, science, and technology. Let me also start sharing my screen here. All right. And then we also have with us today Martin Chiettini. Martin is a 3D artist in the same team. Martin studied digital arts at the University for Applied Arts in Vienna and joined the lab in 2019. He is taking care of the IT infrastructure at the team and is developing virtual reality applications. Further, we have Sebastian Pirch. Sebastian is a 3D artist, also in the Menche team. And he's a designer who studied digital art also at the University for Applied Arts in Vienna. And he joined the group in 2017 and works on interactive virtual reality visualizations of large data sets. And then, last but not least, we have Tim Davison. Tim is pull up my notes. Tim is an independent computer graphics researcher and programmer, and he is also the developer of CellWalk, which is an amazing application for Vision OS and iPad, which I quite enjoyed myself when I recently bought an Apple Vision Pro. All right. Wonderful to have you guys on. This is going to be very exciting. This is the event goes for another 4 hours, and this is like prime real estate on Sunday morning. So thank you all for joining us. And I know, Tim, it's very early, so thank you very much. I'm going to give a brief primer, probably about 5 to 10 minutes, about why 3D and about data visualization in VR. And then I'm going to give it over to each of you for your own talks, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. So, why 3D? Again, my name is Andy. I'm the research lead here at IU in the team. And I want to briefly talk about data visualization in VR. This is a quote by computer scientist Daniel Keim from 2001. Visual data exploration seeks to integrate humans in the data exploration process, applying their perceptual abilities. The basic idea is to present the data in some visual form, allowing data analysts to interact with it. So what this quote really speaks to is the symbiotic nature of data visualization and humans. Because visualization is for humans only. A machine does not need a visualization of a data set in order to make sense of it. And so, of course, many different formalizations have been made for making, interpreting, and teaching data visualizations. One of them is the data visualization literacy framework, which underlies all of the data visualization contributions that our team here is attempting to make. And it is a way to formalize color theory, graphic symbols, and graphic variables, as well as different reference system into a coherent teaching and application framework. There's an associated paper for this, and I added a QR code here if you are curious, and I can put the link into the chat in a second as well. And I want to briefly talk about a study that we did about 2 to 3 years ago about optimizing performance and satisfaction in movement tasks in virtual reality. What you see here is a virtual version of Luddy Hall, which is the building that I'm sitting in right now, actually. You can see that it's a bit of a very angular but irregular building. You can see that it is a higher resolution version of the atrium, and then the rest is just kind of hinted at. It's actually surprisingly realistic with how this building looks. And for the study, we had a control and an experiment group. Half of all the subjects were assigned to either of these groups. Both of these teams filled out a pre-questionnaire with information about the demographics and the experience with VR and 3D visualization. And then they had to do an experiment. So they had to do 24 navigation tasks where they had to go from one space in the 3D building to another, and we timed them. And then half of the people just took a break. That was the control group. The experiment group, however, looked at the visualization of their own data in 3D, in a miniaturized version of the building's model. And then they did the same tasks again, and then we measured which of the two groups had improved by more, the groups that had seen their own data and the groups that did not see their own data. I mean, spoiler, the group that did see their own data actually were faster. And then we gave them a little post question, yeah. So this is what the test setup looked like. You can see the west view of the building up here and the north view up here. This is where the user started at the top of this staircase. And then they had to go to this first room, which was just a tutorial room, kind of just for practice. So we just didn't count this particular task when we evaluated later on. And then they had to go to these increasingly farther away and more obscure task rooms and tap a little button on the wall, of course, all digital, whenever they would arrive there. In the first round, they could only walk. In the second round, they could only teleport. And in the third round, they could free fly, so go through walls and basically be Superman. And then finally, all of the methods were available in the fourth round. And these tasks did get harder over time. So each subject completed about 48 tasks. And this is what this reflective phase looked like. So half of the subjects were able to go back into VR after the first round and look at this miniaturized model of Luddy Hall, which was about 75 centimeters tall. And then we added in these colorful overlays that showed how the users had moved through 3D space to get to the individual task rooms. And as you can see, this tended to get very dense because each subject had 24 tasks to review, and we logged at a frequency of 10 frames per second. And so, of course, then you had incredibly dense visualizations. And so this is what this actually looked like from the user's perspective. You see up here in the top left, this is where this user started. This is the starting position. You can see in blue is how the user walked, so taking the stairs down here, or in some case, some people later on figured out that they could just drop down through the center of the atrium because there was gravity. But this isn't a game, so you didn't have any health that you had to take care of, so you could just take shortcuts. And then in pink here, these are teleportations. So it shows the individual teleportation points in the direction. And then finally, free flying is here in yellow. You can see that the lines are just much shorter because you could take the straight, like the right road. Another thing that implemented are these two-dimensional auxiliary visualizations that allowed you to see, and I have another slide. No, I don't. That allow you to understand which tasks took a lot of time and which tasks didn't. So on the x-axis, this is the task number, so 1 through 24. On the y-axis is the time spent. So this way, the user could quickly identify for which tasks they took an extraordinarily long amount of time and which tasks they did particularly fast, which would then allow them to optimize their second run. And as I said before, people who did get to see their own data in 3D and in VR were indeed faster in the second round. So with that, this was something pro visualization in 3D. I want to talk a little bit about perceptual challenges for visualization in 3D and in VR. In general, I would argue that one of the big benefits of data visualization at all is simplicity. The ability to break down complex multidimensional data sets into 2 dimensions, maybe with some color applied, and then to identify patterns over time and in space. That is something that data visualization can do, and for that 2D equals simplicity, which is generally a good thing. To remove dimensions and focus on the ones that matter, and playing around with different mappings to look at different angles of the data via these mappings. Now, VR, of course, is 3D by nature. That's kind of the whole point of it. And so naturally there is an interaction cost with being in VR because everything that you look at becomes more complex because it becomes 3-dimensional. Another challenge is occlusion. An important depth cue for humans is that objects that are farther away can be obscured by objects that are closer away. So this naturally limits what we can see in 3D, and sometimes that can be a challenge when you want to visualize data where you might want to see all of the data at once. This is from a network that we visualize. This is just a very crude visualization of a social network of Telegram users. And you can see that some of the smaller nodes and edges in the background are simply not viewable because everything in the foreground, the strong component here, obscures everything else. And so Tamara Munster made the really good observation based on Colin Ware's book that we do not experience our own world in 3D, but rather in 2.05D. We have all of the visions on the X and Y axis, but our depth perception is severely limited. So the amount of information we see in 3-dimensional spaces is limited. We have also the issue of foreshortening, well, sometimes there's a size difference where there really shouldn't be any. So for example, here on the right side, these are two cubes, and this is these are the exact same cubes. This cube is farther away, the blue one, than the pink one. This is with a perspective rendering, which is how we see the world. You can see items that are, farther away appear much smaller. And then this is an orthographic rendering where the two cubes appear at the same time. And in a data visualization where you want to use size to visually encode meaning, that can become a perceptual issue. And then finally, of course, 3D also costs time and cognitive effort. It is more information, more dimensions to process. And so Stephen Few in this book showed me the numbers, argued, wrote a whole chapter actually about not using 3D as a purely aesthetic choice. All right, I do want to briefly say I was invited by TEDx IU in 2022 to give a talk about living and learning in the metaverse, including data visualization in 3D. And I put the QR code here if you are curious. All right, with that, I want to give it over to Tim.
Yeah, amazing. If you don't mind, very nice talk, by the way. If you don't mind, can I share my screen? Okay. All right. Okay, you guys are seeing all this?
We see PowerPoint now or Keynote.
Okay. All right, sweet. Let's get started. Yeah, so I'm Tim, and I make an app called CellWalk, and today I'm going to talk about spatial illustration. So what do I mean by spatial illustration? Taking something like David Goodsell's 2D illustrations, as you'll see in a moment, and bringing them to life spatially in 3D, whether that's on a piece of glass like an iPhone or in something like an Apple Vision Pro. So in the background, or what you're looking at here, this is a Mycoplasma bacteria cell floating in my living room running on an Apple Vision Pro. And this is a pretty cool cell model. My background is computer graphics and computer science, and I don't know anything about biology, but some biologists created this incredible cell model. So particularly Martina and Ludo created this first atomistic whole cell model of a bacteria cell in 2022. What's quite cool about this is that it's atomistic, which means that you can zoom into any one of these 300 million atoms and look at them. So that kind of presents a whole bunch of different challenges. First of all, is like inherently multi-scale when you have something this big, even though this is one of the smallest cells. But also there's a lot of technical challenges for rendering. How do you get something like this that is so large to run efficiently on a piece or an iPhone that only has a very small 5-watt GPU? Often these models run on like a desktop GPU, and that thing for reference would be like 200 or all the way up to 400-watt GPUs. So there's technical challenges to make it run efficiently at 60 frames a second, and also to run at the Retina resolution that these devices have. And the Vision Pro takes all of that and compounds it because the screens are very high resolution. And also, you have to do everything stereo and ideally do it all at 90 frames a second. So let me just start a timer so I stay on track. So let's just answer the fun question, like why 3D? And well, structural biology and molecular visualization, they go all the way back to the start of computer graphics. When computer graphics got started, pretty much right away, people started trying to use computer graphics, 3D computer graphics, to do visualizations of structural biology. And that's because proteins are complex 3D structures, but they're also something you can't even see with a light microscope. So this is just, if you want, sometime go and check this out or look it up on YouTube. Arthur Olson, one of my collaborators, created this thing, this video called Virus Wars back in 1982, and it has a banging soundtrack. I think he said his son created it, so it's cool. Check it out. But back then, the killer app for computer graphics was molecular visualization, or one of the killer apps, anyways. And now, kind of jumping out a bit, and talking a little bit about 2D illustration. So this has probably inspired a lot of people in the talks that you've seen over the last 24 hours. But this is a painting by David Goodsell, and he's created many such paintings. It's a cross section of a neuron down an axon. On the right, that's a myelin sheath, and on the left is the neuron. But back when I was starting my graduate studies, I was given his Machinery of Life book, and as a computer science person, it was quite amazing. And just I read it cover to cover, flipping through all of the illustrations, especially. I was captured by this idea. It's like this is really cool. What if we could bring it to life and use it as an educational resource for students? So it's already in book format, but could we make it even better so you could tap on any one of these things, find out what they are without having to go and look at a legend and look at them in 3D, for example. So that's more than a decade ago, and it's taken more than a decade to get to this point. But this is Cell Walk. It's running on an iPad here, and finally you can do just that. So you can tap on something, find out, oh, hey, this is like this MDS ribosome. Swipe up, and you can read more details about it. And it's also multi-scale. It's kind of like almost a Google Earth moment for cell biology. And I think that's what we're seeing in all of the talks is this multi-scale human is starting to happen, probably quite far away before we can do the full Google Earth zooming from a planet all the way down to a person, down to an atom. But I think someday we'll get there. The other thing that 3D gives us is kind of the ability to do interactive storytelling too. So as part of CellWalk, David Goodsell wrote a tour that takes you through the various systems and components of this Mycoplasma bacteria cell. And yeah, people seem to like it. It's not just biologists who are trying this app out. It seems to be a general audience, especially on the Vision Pro. So you probably came here not for the 2D glass or the 3D glass on like a phone or an iPad, but for the spatial computing stuff. So this is CellWalk running inside of an Apple Vision Pro. And the approach that we took was to put it inside of a portal. So this is actually like a stereoscopic head track portal. So you can move your head back and forth, and it's like looking inside of a 3D window, like a Harry Potter sort of magic bag into a world that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Uh, and it's taken many years to develop this technology, develop this app, and I spent a lot of time just looking at these proteins and the cell model on my laptop screen. And I thought I had a good appreciation for like the 3D structure of these things, like these proteins. But like the day I got the stereoscopic rendering working inside of this device, it was like looking at everything new again. And, I can just speculate without anything to back it up. It's probably because we have a lot of computing or compute power in our brains just devoted to interpreting stereoscopic images and helping us create a 3D representation inside of our minds. So something like the Meta Quest or the Apple Vision Pro with stereoscopic rendering unlocks all of that neural circuitry that you have, and everything just becomes a lot more intuitive. Maybe not intuitive, but just you can build a deeper 3D understanding more quickly. So, uh, it's difficult to explain through like a Zoom call or just showing you on like a 2D presentation, but like it's quite amazing to see the DNA winding its way deep into the cell, and something like an ATP synthase with its really cool structure. Yeah, it takes it to the next level. Uh, and here's the app, just kind of showing some of the interactions. And you might be wondering why we chose a portal. And there's some First of all, there's a technical reason. At the time, the portal, when Vision OS was launched, we launched this on the first day the Vision Pro was available. But back then, this was the only way we could do it. We had to do it inside of this kind of stereo portal. But those limitations, technical limitations, have now been lifted. But the other reason why the portal is kind of nice is just kind of how we're dealing with scale. The cell inside of this 3D portal is, I don't know, 10 or 15 meters tall. If it were outside of the portal and we were doing these crazy like zoom animations with the camera going zoop like right up to the cell, that would be like a big giant apartment building zooming into your face, and it's not going to be very comfortable. So that's actually a very important consideration for spatial computing, developing apps for these spatial computing devices is user comfort. So the portal embeds this environment and the user space in a comfortable way. So you can still see your hands, your legs, the table around you, and that really helps with motion sickness, for example. And no one's complained about getting sick in this app, which is awesome. But they have complained and said, I wish that the cell was not inside of the portal. I wish it was like floating in the space around us. So that's what I've been working on, especially this year, upgrading or rendering technology and optimizing it in every way I can possibly think of to put the cell actually in the space around the user. And so technical challenges like everything you do, you have to do twice, once for each eye. So that already compounds things. Ideally, this has to run at 90 frames a second. So those things have presented challenges. But also, I talked earlier about that multiscale challenge. And that's something we're still designing for. I'm not going to show you my solution here yet. It's not quite ready to show, but it's coming. And I think this is very interesting, being able to walk around the cell and explore it naturally like this, like stick your head inside and get these cutting planes so you can see within these 3D structures is kind of an interesting way to interact with it. But admittedly, that's actually kind of a novelty. The interaction, people aren't might the first time they'll use the app, they'll probably just like walk around and do this because it's cool. But really, we're designing for an experience where you're sitting down on a couch or sitting at a table and just looking at it and interacting with it through spatial gestures. So yeah, molecular visualization was one of the killer apps for 3D computer graphics in the beginning. And I think building these biological experiences for education and exploring these this 3D scientific data, I think this is going to be one of the killer apps for spatial computing. And I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's helped on this project. Ludo, Arthur, and David at Scripps, they've contributed a great deal. My anonymous co-conspirator on this project, H Star, and actually many more anonymous people that I also can't mention directly, but this is a lot of people have contributed to this. And yeah, thank you for watching.
Thanks, Tim. This is nice how everything connects. Last night at 11 p.m. we had a session on multiscale visualization, and Ludo was a part of that panel.
Yeah.
So, and you were in the audience. So it's it all connects. All connects. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna share my screen, and then we're gonna go over to Christiane. All right.
Thank you very much. Yeah, hi. Thanks also for the introduction, also Timothy for the talk. Super interesting to get this insight. So I'm Chris. I'm a researcher, and I'm actually having a background in architecture. And biomedical engineering, yeah, if you want to click through the slides, Andy, I'm happy if you do so. Thank you very much. Awesome. Yeah, so as I said, my background is actually from 3D spatial data or working with 3D data originally. I took a detour from architecture into biomedical engineering, working with molecular data, where we designed, for instance, this DNA rotor, which was a multi-component DNA nanobot in the end. In a broader scope for DNA and like drug delivery purposes. And then I finally applied to Jörg's group as a PhD candidate, and now work with computational biological data, which is initially n-dimensional. We don't know the dimensionality often of it. It's like often more than 1,000 dimensions that we work with, and that we want to visualize and represent meaningfully in a 3-dimensional as well as 2-dimensional setting. If you go to the next slide, I want to thank all people that are involved in this, obviously, because this is not a one-man show usually. And our team is highly interdisciplinary. You will find out soon when Sebastian and Martin will give their talks. We have even many more people now. There is no real picture these days, as we are now Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Network Medicine at the University of Vienna. So yeah, those are all the people involved, ranging from medicine, biology, bionics, art, physics, and bioinformatics, math. You can name it, and it will be in there. So yeah, and me as an architect, as well as a biomedical engineer, sort of feel like I fit into this 3D as well as n-dimensional data kind of representative work. If you go to the next slide, please, I would like to tell you more about what kind of data we actually work with. So usually it's a complex system that we focus on, for instance, the human organism, where we represent this as networks, because those are initially tools, or a tool that we can use as an intuitive representation of those complex systems, which have, if you click next, basically nodes that usually are different individual entities. In our case, could be genes or proteins, and also, if you click next, have interactions amongst them. And those usually actually represent the system's behavior and are actually super meaningful to us to understand. If you click next, we do want to find out eventually which kind of network or systems behavior we can extract from this network. And those are just examples, also published by our group in 2017, a book on networks. Networks can have motifs that are small, little interconnected regions. They can have topological communities or clusters, but also hubs can be identified through understanding a system in a network view, meaning the nodes that are very much important in a network and would cause, for instance, the network to fall apart if they would be missing, or also highly central nodes would apply to that. And through understanding all of those kind of patterns that we can extract from this network, we can finally then go back to our initial context and understand how humans function, or human organisms function, in a health and disease state. If you go to the next slide, please. As you saw now, this was a very small, iconic network and really easy to depict those hidden patterns, let's call them. But if we usually focus on the real-world networks that we want to gain insights from, those are extended to 16,000 nodes often, in this case, a protein-protein interaction network with more than 300,000 links. So this is a 2-dimensional state-of-the-art tool, usually used as a sort of force-based layout methodology that can depict those networks, but unfortunately we are really having a hard time to interpret them, and not even being able to really focus on any local structures, cannot really dissect patterns, and in a visual sense cannot really extract information from using our human perception, which we would in the lab actually work on this premise that human visual perception, as well as the computational efficiency and computational technology sort of would, in a synergy, help us to gain novel insights into these complex systems. And as I said, visual challenges, obviously size and complexity. So if you go to the next slide, what if we could look at this network in a 3-dimensional setting? And this is a little abstract depiction of that. This is also something we are currently or often doing in the lab, is that we work close with art or artistic projects in synergy with the scientific data that we work with. And this is an artistic or abstract representation of the human protein-protein interaction network with, as you see, 16K nodes, 300K links. And if you can change the perspective and suddenly work in top-down as well as bottom-up, like view changes, you suddenly start to understand patterns way better, or can even decipher them. And obviously, this is a visual analysis step at the beginning, but then it would lead to more quantification methods and statistical methods to the local structures or accompanying the local structures that you kind of found interesting to look into. So if you click on the next slide, what in the lab I've been working on recently, and what we kind of always have this grand vision of, is that we can visualize networks, or should be able to visualize networks in a sort of meaningful and interpretable manner, rather than being forced to go to very abstract representations and not really having the opportunity to read out any meaningful patterns, let's say. And to just show you a bit of this framework, if you go to the next slide. So we have this mapping approach, or we took the actually cartography mapping approach in the sense that since we work with this high-dimensional data set, and in this case, it would be genes having several features, such as biological functions or disease associations, that are all meaningful at the same time, but we cannot depict them at once in a three-dimensional setting because it's just n-dimensional. Or very complex. And in the mapping approach, what we always have to be aware of, that is each map, if you even dissect or, well, represent a 3D object into a 2D setting, that you lose information, or you kind of have to sort of model it towards a functioning representation. And this kind of mapping approach kind of, well, very nicely shows this, that you can emphasize specific spatial or structural properties or functional properties of a map of the globe in this case, but you will always, you should always be aware of that there are certain features enhanced or extracted or highlighted in a sense, meaning that if you know this and if you're aware of this, you can interpret the data that you're seeing, and you can, well, focus on the patterns and very much understand what you actually want to focus on as well. So if you go to the next slide, we did basically use this mapping approach and applied this to network data. And in this case, I just extracted a figure of our paper that shows how different layouts in a sequence could be representing different features in a two-dimensional but also three-dimensional setting. And these are all small networks, so 2D works well for them. But as I said before, in the PPI, the protein-protein interaction network, we would have to go to 3D, unfortunately, or fortunately. So if you go to the next slide, there is a little video that shows actually this. I took the cube in this case, the cubical grid, to illustrate our layouts that we came up with. And this is a subset of the layouts that we actually developed. And I visualized them with the data driver platform that Sebastian will introduce later. So this initially is actually a 3D VR view that I captured. And what we now see is that we can learn that the cube has this, well, actual global architecture that we all know well, but then also there is a bipartite nature to it once we focus on local neighborhoods, which you see in this layout that is currently forming. And then we can even focus on different important characteristics of nodes given their, well, importance in the network, meaning that they would influence, if they would go missing, the very much network robustness. So the network would fall apart, for instance, if the very much high degree nodes would be taken out or the high betweenness nodes would be missing. And through that, we can understand the behavior of a system better. And first of all, we'll visually understand it, but then also quantify them, the ideas or hypotheses that we can create based on the visualizations. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to show the 3D cartographs, as we call them, on the protein-protein interaction network. And this is obviously very limited since it's a two-dimensional slide. But imagine these all being visual representations in 3D in the data driver platform, where we first showed, for instance, that functional similarities in a disease context would lead us towards 3D portraits of disease clouds, or the topographic layout, as we called it, would allow us to dissect the information of having genes or proteins laid out in a two-dimensional setting based on their importance in the network structurally, but also combining this in a Z-axis of their functional importance given their disease association quantity. And then we have the geodesic layout, which is sort of a globe, as you can imagine, that in this case, if you go to the next slide, shows a data set that is actually has been investigated by one of our PIs or principal investigators in the LBI now, Julia Guthrie, who worked with a rare patient disease data set that she would use the platform for to actually extract meaningful genes or prioritize genes in this patient data set to understand which kind of monogenic rare disease would actually be the case here. And then for sort of a follow-up, those genes that were identified by her work could actually lead towards new drugs being purposed and given to this patient after being diagnosed with the right sort of gene as well as monogenic rare disease, and that this patient could be helped eventually. So, and in this case, you see the data set that were used, or the visualizations that were used, and the analytics parts that were used in this platform to find out more about these gene prioritization problem. So yeah, and with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And you will see more now about our VR platform.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was an excellent talk and beautiful illustrations and networks, of course. Okay, next up is Sebastian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Yeah, my name is Sebastian. I'm from Austria. Proceed with the slide, please, for me. My journey into 3D started at the age of 15 when I made an apprenticeship as a repro technician, where I learned Photoshop, Quark Express, and all desktop publishing apps. My sad existence consisted of drawing Bezier paths around things for 8 hours a day. I was really bored, so I started learning 3ds Max. Next slide, please. I made some silly little animation clips and soon started doing some jobs for architects and advertisement agencies. Next slide, please. I did also quite a bit of visuals and in situ art using interactive video projections. Soon I was asked to do stage design for theater and opera performances. I started programming with pure data to create tools for my real-time 3D and video projections. Next slide, please. This developed into my own game engine, which was featured by a few big tech blogs at the time. No, this was in 2010 or something, before Unreal and Unity were usable for free for anyone. Next slide, please. I studied media art at the University for Angewandte Kunst in Vienna. Very obsessed myself with building robots and that possessed varying kinds of agency. Here is one that can fly and crash on its own. Here a toy tank that can draw pictures, and yeah, I created some unholy contraptions. I really enjoy getting to the metal. There is nothing like the smell of solder lead in the morning. Next slide, please. Since 7 years, I work in academia. I'm the lead developer of the Data Diver project for Jörg Menche at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Network Medicine. Next slide, please. Why 3D? I'm mischievous, so I took this in the sense like, why would you like to make this 3D if 2D works? Sorry, please go one slide back. I was too fast. Yeah, seriously, why are people so afraid of 3D? And believe me, I had my share of 3D phobics. Symptoms range from slight annoyance to outright panic when they see a Hütter teapot. After all, the world we live in is 3D, so where's the problem? Well, yes, but thanks to gravity, we are confined to a mere 2D projection onto this 3D world. Considering this, a map is a perfectly adequate, simplified representation of reality. I believe this is one reason why we like to default to that in visualization. Only by flying, one can truly experience the full nature of 3D space and become volumetric. Here I got a bit poetic. I'm a paraglider pilot, by the way. Next slide, please. I take off with my plastic bag from a little hill, see a bird and catch a thermal with him. And with every circle, their perspective changes as we gain altitude. First I see over the little hill with the takeoff, then over the small mountain behind it. I leave as the belly of the cloud gets closer, avoiding getting sucked into it and head on. I observe wisps of clouds and terrain under me, looking for potential thermal triggers and lifting ridge lines. I'm calculating a fluid dynamic simulation in my head as I fly along. Every cube of air in this Boltzmann lattice has different temperature, humidity, pressure, and velocity. It's a continuous series of educated guesses to find the favorable ones. Next slide, please. Okay, here I got carried away a bit, but my point is 3D is overwhelming, and not everybody has the spatial imagination suitable for entertaining mental models of random stuff in 3D. Furthermore, most don't have a good use for it, apart from the most obvious use case, which is displaying a LiDAR point cloud where everybody can appreciate a good 3D representation because it is exactly what it is. However, when it comes to more abstract usage of third dimension, folks tend to get nervous. Believers, like this crowd, I assume, know that 3D is the next logical step in the evolution of information design. And I'd like to take the last minute to talk about a few challenges I encountered in my project and how we tried to address them. First of all is usability. Next slide, please. With usability, I mean that 3D programs are usually a can of worms, and scientists are simply not able to use them in any meaningful way. So we addressed this with the architecture of our data analysis platform, the Data Diver. And it has a backend that is realized in Python using Flask, which is a web server for Python, because scientists usually are quite cool with Python. And here they can do pretty much anything. They can prepare their data, make layouts of them. They can also make some web pages that will be shown in the virtual reality to allow for basic interactivity with their data. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is what I mentioned, the HTML pages that the backend serves. So the backend and the front end is both in Python. And Socket.io is used for the communication between those two. So it's a bidirectional tunnel where information can go back and forth. The next slide, please. Yeah, here you can download that stuff if you're interested. Next, please. And on top sits the virtual reality module, which is realized in Unreal Engine, where you can use VR if you want or not, if you don't, to look at your data and hopefully get smarter with the visualizations that you can see. I think I'm already running out of time, but that's fine. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you, Sebastian. I really enjoyed that recording of the power gliding. That was just beautiful. All right, wonderful. Next up, we have Martin, and Martin is going to share his own slides. I think you might still be muted, Martin.
I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Because for me, Zoom totally vanished now. Thanks, Zoom. But I think I can do it anyway. So I'm Martin. I'm also part of a group of Jörg Menke, which now is transforming into the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Network Medicine in Vienna. So brief about me. I started to like computers in 1984. And then I started, like 14 years later, I started to use them for creating artworks and doing various things with like 3D and also audio and video and all kinds of interactive things. So then I studied digital arts, and I finished studying in 2016. And my diploma work was in virtual reality. And then I started at Jörg's group as a 3D artist in 2018. And since then, we made a few transformations, and I'm now also responsible for hardware and IT. And I'm also creating art in virtual reality, like specifically with our project Echtzeit Kunstwelt, which is a few artists together, and we are trying to create basically frameworks to create art in virtual reality. So why 3D? The question that brings us all together. In my opinion, 3D is like the obvious choice for spatial data, like for example, organs. As you can see here, once this shape starts moving, it becomes way less abstract. It's way more clear how it looks like in real life. And the same is true for like whole body models. Again, you can see like once you start spinning these things, once you start getting into the 3D parts of it, it just makes more sense. And so I think you guys might have to explain why you're using 3D, but for me, these are pretty obvious things where I would use 3D. And of course, the same would be true for like an airport network where you see all the airports and which one is connected to which one. And on the right side, we see a 2D representation in a roughly geospatial layout. And we can already see that Europe, like behind Europe, we have a lot of connections that are not immediately visible to us, which if we would see this in 3D and could spin it around would make way more sense. So why 3D for more abstract data, like for example, point clouds? Why would we use 3D? Well, I'm going to start with this example, which is a perceptual art piece by Michael Murphy. And I'm going to play the video now, and you will immediately see why. Well, once you go into the room and once you get a new perspective, you can immediately tell this is not the shape of an eye, but it's like a data cloud that spans through dimensions. And so people came up with all kinds of tricks. Like, for example, here is shown UMAP, what UMAP does to this mammoth model. And while I really like what it does, and it also gives you a nice overview of the data that is partially occluded in the 3D model, as long as you don't move it. As soon as you start moving the 3D model, it immediately gives us the true shape of this mammoth, the way we would see it in real life. So it makes a lot of sense to show it in 3D and not reduce the dimension to 2D. So the question that we always get asked is why virtual reality? So the 3D is kind of skipped, but people at some point realized that 3D is also part of the virtual reality. So why do we do that? Because first off, it's immersive. It gives us the possibility to experience shapes the way that we are used to. And that comes with a lot of positive side effects, like the intuition that you have from your real life translates into this virtual space. So abstract, and the next point would be that abstract data, at the moment it's abstract, like for example, a protein interaction network within one cell. Like once we have a model of that cell, we can also align the abstract data to this model, at least to times, like to points in time for this model. And then also the 3D part, again, will make much more sense. And it gives you a totally different perspective. Like you can basically scale yourself, or you can scale the model until you are the size of a protein. And then you can see all your neighbors like you would see them in real life, basically. So with all of this, I'm coming to an end, and I'm going to show our data exploration platform again. Here we see Julia, where she's doing a variant prioritization task. And she basically she's not sure yet what she's gonna look for, so she uses the platform to explore the possibilities, like to see things that she might not be able to see in 2D because it's just too much data. And with that, I give back to Andreas. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Martin. All right, we do have some time for a panel discussion. I have questions for each and every one of you after seeing the talks and after reviewing the slides. But I want to focus on one particular one that I think is relevant for us all. So, and it kind of jumps off the last slide that Martin was showing. There's multiple modes in data visualization, and three of the most common ones are communication, so communicating with predetermined results, exploring, like open exploration of a data set, trying out different configurations to find interesting patterns, and then analysis. And so I find the first two to be rather amazing and straightforward in VR. But doing analysis in VR is challenging because you do not have your typical analysis tools. Like, for example, taking notes is very hard to do in VR. Typing is incredibly tiresome in VR. So I'm curious, since many of us deal with data visualization in VR, what are your thoughts on improving the note-taking and analysis experience when dealing with complex VR visualizations? And I want to throw that question to Chris first.
Yeah, thanks. I also think that Sebastian has an interesting take on that because we do, like, given our platform, we kind of discuss this point actually very often. And like data exploration per se should also be documentable, right? And like reproducible in a sense. So you can, like, given all the insights that you gained, obviously through the visualizations and then through the analysis in the platform, another person or your collaborator should also be able to follow up on that, or more like different sort of explorations should go into one project. So it needs to be reproducible in a sense. So we're really trying to now focus on the very natural ways of how humans actually communicate in their sort of, not in VR obviously, but in real life, which is usually natural language beyond, any kind of interface, not a keyboard or anything, just your speech, right? As well as gestures. So the most natural things that we use usually to communicate are those two things. And I, as a user of the platform, would also argue that these are the most promising ones to go for. And I want to give this to Sebastian because I think he has valuable insights as well.
Thank you, Chris. This is indeed a really big challenge. In my opinion, VR is not suited for everything. For example, I would not want to code in VR, and especially the analysis part takes a lot of coding. So the way we made our platform is that you're not meant to use it exclusively in VR, but you can code something on your laptop and then put on the headset and check out how it looks and go back to your computer. So it's like a multimodal, multi-device kind of way of interacting with it. That being said, like our next big hope is, of course, coming with proper language detection, which is working since like only a year or two with OpenAI Whisper, that it can actually recognize like the abbreviations of genes and stuff, which were always like a huge pain in the butt to get it right. So the goal for the future is to have like really something like an enterprise computer that you can ask it questions. There is a LLM running in the background that is aware of what kind of algorithms it can use to do things, and in that way interact with the computer in a much more natural way.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up speech recognition. I have noticed in the past, like when wearing a VR headset, including the Apple Vision Pro, the ability to just dictate is super valuable. So for example, let's say you have the Apple Vision Pro one and you just want to write somebody a text, which is nice that you can do that in Apple Vision Pro, but even their typing is so tiresome. So then using the speech dictation works really nicely. And there have been some, and I don't know if any of you has experience with this, there have been some pretty big improvements, especially in Unreal Engine with AI-driven NPCs. I've seen some really amazing tech demos by NVIDIA where you have an NPC that reacts to natural language input by a player. I don't know how scalable that is. I don't know how useful that is for something very specific like analysis tasks. Like for example, if you ask an NPC, "Hey, what's the third and first quartile of this data set here?" I just don't know if you would get anything useful out of that. But that's another thing that might become useful here in the future. So yeah, Tim, Martin, do you guys have any thoughts on, helping out with these, very common non-VR tasks when wearing a headset?
Yeah, I think the operating systems themselves are starting to take over a lot of these tasks, like you mentioned, the Apple Vision Pro. So that brings like all the iPad apps for note taking. You can use them within the device, or you can connect your Mac as like a virtual screen within these things. But I think OpenXR, like Google just announced this like last week, but one of their things that they're doing is their Gemini AI model can see everything you're doing. So there's probably going to be some interesting interactions where it could just automatically take note of some interesting stuff happening on your screen, or you could just say, "Hey, like take a snapshot of this." Take some dictation notes. So that's probably a very cool way to handle the problem.
Yeah, when I spent about 25 hours developing for Vision OS just to make a little hello HRA application actually. And since you mentioned, the spatial computing aspect with the Apple Vision Pro, like I had a virtual display here, and then I could preview my Unity application here. So then you write some code, you save, you run, and then you turn around and your 3D scene is right there next to your coding window. So that's when I realized, okay, this is what spatial computing actually means. And I mean, this is only just the beginning. So yeah, as you say, the operating system hopefully supports bringing these two worlds a bit more together in the future. All right, I do think we have time for one more question. And the question that I would like to pose is about 3D phobia. So Sebastian, I like the term 3D phobia, and I encounter it all the time, all the time. And on top of that, VR phobia. And it's not that people dislike it. It's just you constantly have to argue for, hey, why do you want to use this particular modality that makes everything more cost intensive and more cognitively intensive? And I was wondering, in a question to the group here, what are your common responses to that? Just kind of like, snappy responses that you kind of have ready to go. Curious here. So maybe Martin, maybe you can start sharing your thoughts.
I mean, yeah, my favorite one I already mentioned, and Sebastian also mentioned it. It's like we live in a 3D world. Somehow makes sense. Like if your data is already three-dimensional, why argue about using 3D to show it? If it's not three-dimensional, if it's super abstract data, of course, people have other, how do you say it? Other excuses for not using 3D. But I also think, I mean, one more dimension that you're already used to is always, in my opinion, nearly always better, aside from reading a book, maybe.
Yeah, Chris, Tim, do you guys have any like snappy responses that you sometimes have ready?
Yeah, sure. So just maybe look at what Meta and Apple are kind of imagining the future is going to be like. We're going to be walking around with these like AR glasses. So ideally, it just becomes something seamless that people take for granted, that they're just wearing these things and they have cells floating around them in their living room. So I think that's maybe what's going to happen. And as far as like VR phobia, like going back to the early days of VR and putting on these big giant headsets, actually even with the Apple Vision Pro, it's still like quite a bit to put on. But once they become more comfortable, I think they'll become more ubiquitous.
Yeah, I would agree. In architecture, it even becomes even normal that a headset is part of the deal and even offered to clients to walk through their buildings before they're even nearly built or finished. And I would hope the same applies to biological or biomedical data.
Yeah, I agree that the form factor is really deciding. And I want to end with a quick anecdote from, we had a panel yesterday with editors, like journal editors. And one of the panelists there, who's an editor at Nature Methods, told us that for a VR paper that was submitted to them a bit ago, they actually shipped a VR headset across the world to the 3 reviewers. And so if a journal like Nature Methods is already doing this, then maybe the future for the acceptance of these kinds of head-mounted devices is also improving. I found that very amusing and also very encouraging. With that, we are at the hour. As per usual, there's never enough time to really discuss all of these questions in detail. I will follow up with each of you, and we're going to set debrief meetings because I would love to keep the conversation going. With that, thank you very much, and I want to give it over to Bruce for the 9 a.m. panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. I also want to give a quick shout out to my mom and my aunt who are in the audience. Thank you for joining. Bye.